Okay, item number 10B, cannabis legislature laws and formal discussion. I believe the commission was in agreement last month as to where to put and how to move forward with what we wanted to see for legislature laws. Barbara, would you or Vince like to talk to the commission at this time and see how we should move forward?
Happy to do that. And Ryan, if you can share your screen. Liz unfortunately could not be here. She had a meeting conflict. And together we put a little tutorial here so you know what you're getting into and what the broad rules are. And at the end of the discussion, we can see how those rules impact where you may like to allow the sale of cannabis to take place. So if I can have the next slide, Ryan, second slide. I think some of this doesn't apply to you necessarily, but I think to place this in context, you need to understand the licensing procedure. The licenses, while you're involved in land use, the licenses really come from the Department of Consumer Protection, and they fall into 4 broad categories that you can see on the screen. One is growing, and there are 2 subcategories. One is a cultivator and a micro cultivator, and we'll come back to the latter one. But those are large ones and smaller ones. Then there is the production, the person who's manufacturing a product, taking from the grower and putting it into a product. Someone who is converting the product to the raw product to food and beverages. And then there's someone who's putting a label on the product. So the grower and the producer could be one and the same, but there are separate licenses. The third category, which affects you in particular, should you go forward, is the sale to the public. And there are 2 categories there. One is the retailer, the person who is selling the product, and a hybrid retailer, which covers the category of one who may already be authorized for the sale of marijuana as medical marijuana. So somebody can do both, but if they're doing both, they still need an additional license. And then they get the 4th person involved, the person who's distributing it. So if you want home delivery from the retailer to you, there is a specialized license for someone who is going to give you curb service. And then there's the transporter who can take the product from the grower or the producer to the retailer. So those are all individual licenses that DCP will have their fingers in going forward. Next one. Next slide, Ryan. So these are all the definitions, and I won't go into them in great detail, but I think the 2 that are most applicable to our understanding of where the commission may like to go is the micro cultivator and the retailer. The micro cultivator is someone who is growing this stuff in not less than 2,000 square feet, no more than 10,000 square feet of space prior to any expansion. So if someone wanted to do this and only wanted to have 1,000 square feet, they're not allowed. You have to have a minimum of 2,000 square feet to become a grower. And you can initially apply for a license to have 10,000 square feet. Now, and then thereafter, you're allowed to expand in 5,000 square foot increments up to 25,000 square feet. And at which point, then you would have to get converted to be a cultivator. A retailer, the definition is a little bit more obvious. It's somebody who is not the dispensary or a hybrid, but is licensed to sell a cannabis product. The rest of them really don't apply to you, and you'll see that why in a minute. Okay, next slide, Ryan. So micro cultivators. So if you had the notion of allowing the product to be grown legally in Derby, it would be appropriate for you to identify locations that are appropriate for a micro cultivator. Somebody relatively small, 5,000 square foot. It's interesting that it has to be, the growing must occur in a room with walls. Now we haven't had the full discussion, but we alerted Barbara to the question, do those walls, can they be open to the sky? Or do they have to be in a building? Regardless, they have to be something that is not really open to the public view. basically. So it has grown inside. Now, in our climate here, the likelihood of someone growing it outside is more remote because of the weather conditions and being limited. Somebody's investing, they're likely to grow indoor. So it essentially becomes a manufacturing operation of a certain size. Manufacturing in Derby can occur in an industrial zone. Can occur elsewhere too, in this case, perhaps if you allow it. But the likely thought here is that a cultivator really is more appropriate in an industrial zone. Next slide, please. So there are some municipal authority questions. The city is allowed, a municipality is allowed to charge the retailer or the grower for special services that may be required. Interestingly, up in of all places, Northampton, Massachusetts, a retailer is so popular on weekends they have to have a traffic cop. That's for all of the Connecticut people running across the line. But you're allowed to do that. After the first 30 days of opening, you can provide reasonable, you can recover those public safety costs up to a certain amount as prescribed here in the law. But no host agreements mean is that you and Ansonia couldn't combine to have a special public safety force to do this work. It would have to be a legitimate city function. Next slide. So you can, if you want, and many communities are, prohibiting establishment of any cannabis facilities. You can establish with reasonable restrictions on hours and signage and location. And the general theory is among the planning community is the restrictions should not be greater necessarily than similar sensitive receptors is what they're called, such as liquor stores, in relationship to their location for schools, churches, charities, and hospitals. So that begins to limit. And I think if you stray too far from the liquor statutes that you may have, that you already have in your codes, in your zoning code, one would argue, if I were the liquor store, why would cannabis be less restrictive than liquor? So the general approach here is that you might want to look at it in terms of how you are now regulating liquor stores in relationship to other activities such as schools, churches, and so on. How about the next slide, Ryan? So this is essentially what I'm saying, is that you can create zoning standards as if, and this comes from the statutes, as if for any other similar use other than a cannabis establishment. If you don't set your zoning standards, someone could come in and just do this as a business as long as they fit similar standards as with similar uses. I would recommend that you adopt very specific regulations for how you intend and where these establishments can occur in Derby. I think that here's an important criteria. A micro cultivator, you're at the moment. And
Vince, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Do we need separate regulations for every single one of these things that we want to do?
No, you would set a general standard as if you were to do any other use.
Okay.
All right. Now, the one interesting thing here is, and this would apply until 2024, you're only allowed to have one retailer and one micro cultivator in your city because it's limited to, it's based on population of 25,000. Your population is only, the latest census is about 12,300 people. And so until 2024, when this restriction seems to go away, unless the General Assembly re-ups it, you're only going to get one of each. You're not going to get a plethora of these things. However, that applies to the retailer and the micro cultivator, and it's silent on all of the other licenses. So that's another question that we raised to Barbara as to how to interpret that. But again, I think the likelihood of you're getting a very, very large operation of 15, 20,000 as a big grower is not terribly likely. Next one, Ryan, please. So where do we go? So the questions that you need to ask and discuss here are what zones are appropriate for growing, the production, and the sale and distribution. Do you want to treat, do you only want to separate the micro and the retailer and ignore the other stuff? And I think you'd probably be all right with that. I don't think you need to get into how the product is delivered from a manufacturer to a store. I think that begins to be a little overkill in terms of regulation, and Sarah doesn't have the time to get into that. You'd need a full-time person doing that. I think the question you also need to address is how specific do you want to be? As to proximity to those other uses, you control hours and you can control signage. Next slide, please, Ryan. So here's your Derby map. You're all familiar with that. But what we have done, and go to the next one more quickly, Ryan. So in your, and you'll see why I skipped over that, but the Derby zoning for liquor outlets is 1,500 feet from another liquor outlet, school, public park, or church. Your measurement standards on how that's done is established, and you do allow liquor operations in shopping centers that have 50,000 square feet or more, and it is a single shopping center. So that's what you now have. So think of that when you apply to the next one. Next, Ryan, next slide. So what we did here is we took parks and schools. We didn't have a convenient way for tonight's discussion to identify a location of churches. So if in the blobs, those are the 1,500 foot radiuses. If you act on the premise that a retail use is appropriate in a business zone, could be also in an industrial zone. And so in your mill district, you don't have any restrictions of churches and so on nearby. In your centered development districts, there's a little bit of restrictions up on the northerly side. In your business one zone up on the Ansonia line up by Division Street, a little bit gets carved out, could be up there. In the other industrial zone along Route 8, there's some possibilities in the industrial area. But then when you go to East Derby and you start plugging in parks and schools in relationship to your business zone, you can see on the right there out on New Haven Road, Route 34, that whole area falls within the 1,500 feet measurement of a park. So you begin to see that the locations in sort of self-winnow to where they could be appropriate. Now you can go and make it more strict than that. If for example, you said, we don't want this in the downtown district, period, that's okay. But those are the decisions that, and this is the context. Go to the next, I think, which is the last slide, Ryan. Oh, and this just gets into some finer stuff as to what we would have to address in the advertising, marketing, and window displays in terms of what can be shown and what can't be. So this is a fine-grained thing. We don't need to get in it for tonight. But I think the threshold discussions are you looking at both the micro and the retailer? Are they different locations? Do you want them to be different locations? Do you want to follow somewhat less restrictive than the liquor, more restrictive than the liquor? Do you want to exclude it from certain zones for whatever reason? And so that's the nature of the discussion where we're at now. And based on what we hear tonight, then we can craft a regulation pretty quickly. But I think that it is we needed to go through, I needed to go through this exercise so I could understand the pages of what the law said. Now, I don't know, Barbara, has any more thoughts on this, but we've shared this with her. And I think we're probably in sync. There are a couple of minor questions that don't need to get resolved tonight, but for us to continue our work. So that's.
No, I was just going to comment on that issue regarding the section that has restrictions for retailers and micro cultivators, but not cultivators or hybrid retailers. And I really can't make sense of it. I understand from a colleague of mine that there's supposed to be guidance coming out from the state
From DCP.
on this legislation. So maybe we'll be able to have a further understanding of that. It particularly doesn't make sense to me that there would be restrictions for micro cultivators, but not cultivators, which are much bigger. So I don't, I'm not sure what the legislature was thinking about that. The one question I had, Vince, I totally agree with your approach. Those are the important issues that the commission needs to decide to go forward on this and get a specific proposed regulation crafted. And I agree that a cultivator, it's not likely that someone like that would come into Derby. But what about the hybrid retailer?
Well, is there a dispensary now in Derby? No,
okay, so that all right, so that would have to be only where there's already a dispensary for the medical. Okay, I did.
Or unless somebody wanted to apply separately for a dispensary license in the city. And
well, what if somebody already has the license for the medical and is located somewhere else? I've been told that there's the ability to relocate.
I don't know that. My experience with one dispensary goes back a couple of years ago, and DCP was limiting the total number of dispensaries for medical marijuana at that time. And they were treating it, and this is in the case of Southington, and Southington treated it as a general business use, as if it were a pharmacy. And wherever a pharmacy could be, they said that would be acceptable. So in the case of Southington, they allowed that location. But at the time, DCP was only issuing so many licenses geographically to spread them out. Whether or not those same rules will apply here remains to be seen. DCP has not, by the way, as far as I know, while this is the enabling statute, the administration, the regulation that accompany statutes isn't there yet. I don't think.
Right. So again, hopefully that's going to give us more guidance as we move forward.
Right. But I think the big questions here are looking at this map, looking at how you now restrict liquor. What are the appropriate geographies? Do you want to separate those geographies between the production, micro production, and perhaps even be more flexible on the location micro production, because they're not necessarily selling it to the public. So I hate to, the sensitivity of liquor and in proximity to churches and schools and parks came about because we don't want children becoming close to such violent stuff, so in this particular case, if you treat it the same way, I think that's okay, but you might want to treat micro a little differently if it's micro exclusively. So we're open to thoughts because we need the guidance here, and my recommendation is that it shouldn't be wide open. I think you really need to tailor it to appropriate locations in the town within the framework that we just established.
I could jump in. I got a couple opinions on everything we just talked about. As far as the micro cultivator, I don't think you should restrict that really at all within acceptable business districts, such as like B1 zones, whatever. I think what Vince said is pretty accurate. If you have a let's say an 8,000 square foot building somewhere and all they do is grow weed inside, I don't think it really affects a church, a school, what have you, as long as it's not being distributed out of the same building. And then as far as the retail, I don't know how the commission feels about the retail being in like our downtown district, but I will say that if you do adopt the same law or the same regulation as the liquor, the amount of churches in downtown is going to take out most of it anyway. Any place that you're going to have a spot to open it in a downtown district is going to be down towards the river where there's currently a whole lot of nothing. And then also the Mill Design District is basically the two spots you're going to pigeonhole that and a small part of Division Street, which I think is also a reasonable area to have a small, like a retail location for that. I guess that's my two.
Let me, Dan, let me qualify when you said the micro anywhere in a B zone. Would you also allow the micro grower to be in one of your industrial zones?
By B zone, I mean any non-residential,
Okay.
Not hospital campus, not you know what I mean. Any place that that business would commonly be allowed to be conducted.
Okay. I think that's reasonable, by the way. But again, for clarity.
No P, no HC, no residential zones. I tend to agree with Dan on that. Mill Design District, perfect. There's a whole lot of nothing in the MDD
Part of the
zone.
big limiting factor or anti-limiting, however you want to look at it, is going to be the square footage requirement. You're going to have an industrial space. You're going to have three-phase power. You're going to have adequate electricity to have a grow facility based on the air conditioning needs and the lighting needs, stuff like that. It's not applicable. It's not feasible to have it in a residential neighborhood, put it that way.
Right.
It's something that you're going to need more or less industrial or commercial infrastructure to handle anyway. I think that and the square footage requirement is going to kind of push you towards what we would consider a reasonable location anyhow for a grow operation.
Hey, let's keep in mind something, folks. We're only allowed one of each. That's
Correct.
it. One retailer and one micro grower. So I think we had some informal discussions before, and we're pretty much all in agreement that we would like to get the best of each. If we're only allowed one, let's get the best and maybe the biggest too. That's why I'm kind of leaning towards the B1 zone, because that's where we have our shopping centers. Those shopping centers are greater than 50,000 square feet, so we don't have that liquor restriction that we do in other zones, other locations. And we have a lot of vacant space, a lot of big vacant space in our shopping centers. Some of that vacant space has been vacant for over 10 years. They're looking for some kind of a use that, heretofore hasn't appeared before them.
So Ryan, excuse me, Dave, I want you to continue there if you don't mind, but can you bring up the zoning map, Ryan?
Yes.
Because Dave, let's talk about that B1 zone that you just talked to, that you mentioned. Let's examine those zones.
Again, Vince, what Dave I think is saying is more for the cultivator, the micro cultivator side of things, not necessarily having a giant, retail.
Yeah, no, I don't think anybody's going to have a giant retail.
Okay, Dan, I didn't catch that distinction, Dave.
Well, I mean, if we have a giant retailer, we'll be the biggest one in the state of Connecticut. I can tell you that.
But to Dave's point, as well as mine, is that I don't think that should be restricted if you're only cultivating in that location. However, I guess against Dave's point is I don't think Adam should get turned into a grow facility because it's a fairly public place, and it's just going to, now it's going to be a giant factory smack dab in the middle of a shopping center, and it's not going to be open to the public.
But we got to take into consideration, we don't know what the restrictions that Big Y has put on the, on them taking over and signing into lease. What's in their lease? Do they welcome these things with open arms, or do not? Just because the city of Derby wants something somewhere doesn't mean it's going to go there.
Right,
Because
you're
there may
right.
be restrictions that these people have in their lease that says, I'd rather not be associated with this. That's not my MO. And then all bets are off.
Ryan, go to the other map with the circles. I think that's more appropriate. So
Let me throw something out to you. Where would a place like On Time Screen Printing fall? And I know you're not supposed to zone for businesses are there, but I'm using it as a for example. Say somebody wanted to buy that property, they have retail space up above and they have manufacturing below. You know, I don't know if that would fit. I don't know how the commission feels about that.
So that goes, that's in a business zone, right?
B2.
Right
Yes,
B2 zone.
me too.
Right down here.
So it seems to me that that's an appropriate thing, right?
Okay.
Appropriate use. Me,
I'm just throwing these possible locations in town out there because they look like they're good uses for either or both.
Yep.
I think you may want to keep in mind that some of these zones, like B2, for example, I think there's probably some properties that are appropriate and perhaps some that aren't so appropriate in terms of their size, available parking, particularly as you go towards, if you follow my cursor here, towards, no, of course, we're starting to get in close proximity to churches and things of that nature, but perhaps on New Haven Avenue, you have a lot of smaller properties, thinking along the lines of Marie Antoinette's, perhaps.
Which wouldn't fit.
The barbecue joint, and then heading north, I think there's the, I forget if it's the Polish War Veterans Club, I forget what the current name of the restaurant is right at the 34 Bridge, but you know, those B2 properties, you know, aren't necessarily what you have down on Commerce Drive, what you have perhaps over on Derby Milford Road,
Right.
Krausers.
Yeah, that's another example I was going to bring up, the area next to Krausers. You know, there's a lot of space. It seems like a good location that wouldn't be prohibited by the size of the building that might go there or by what's surrounding it.
So what I'm hearing is that the other site development restrictions for the particular use, and I think I would categorize exclusive micro, as an industrial use and would apply parking standards that you have in other industrial areas, right? I think I'm
So.
talking out loud. A retail use would have to meet all other site development standards that you have. I don't think you should be doing carve outs. So a retailer, if you require four spaces per 1,000 square feet, then they would have to have, you know, that number of spaces on the site. So that's going to limit some of the smaller properties that may fall in these zones.
Well, what makes me a little nervous about it though too, Vince, is that you may have some existing retail operations at those properties where it could be considered a continuation.
Yes, you can. Yeah,
That clearly have inadequate parking today. And if you get a marijuana retailer, I think at least initially, you have a serious parking problem.
Well, I would argue, Ryan, on that point, that the intensification of one retail use to another allows the commission to impose more stringent parking standards. They just don't get grandfathered because retail is retail is retail.
Right. I'll concede that, but you know, the regulations do allow for, you know, unless there's a different parking standard.
Yeah.
For a you know, that the ZEO has the authority to approve a change in use.
Yeah.
From now another question actually that brings up another good point. do we want these to be special exception uses? I think that's probably appropriate, right?
That's up to the commission, but let me alert you. You want to, I think you're right that it should be a special exception. However, do you require special exceptions for liquor stores?
No.
Then I think you're on thinner ice. I think. Again, we shouldn't be making, in tongue in cheek, I was going to say, if you start doing special exceptions, do you want to be on all night hearings? Because I can guarantee you, based on my experience in Southington, the moment somebody comes in here, that one person, it's going to be an endless hearing. However, I think this where you're going into new territory, you're going into new zoning territory in the state of Connecticut with these things. So that really is up to you.
Let me throw this monkey wrench into the mix for you guys. Specifically with respect to, again, micro cultivators, because I think it actually could make sense. What about the newly formed SDD provision? Would you exclude that from any of this, or would you include it?
You know, Dan, I was thinking about that, not necessarily with the SDD, but with the with your PDDs. Do you want these to come in into any of your PDDs, or even into your center design development district? But I think that's an issue that you need to discuss, or need to, should you only allow it as an SDD? But again, that becomes more restrictive, or could become more restrictive than a liquor store in a retail setting. So I think if someone, okay, the SDD, it can be done in any non-residential zone, right?
And the carve-outs.
And the carve-outs. So you could do it one of two ways. One of saying, no, it is not, you would amend SDD to prohibit this use, or you could allow it and be open to that as a suggestion.
For example, like, isn't there a property over on like 10th or West 9th or something like that that's technically in a residential area, but it's a commercial building? That would be qualify for the SDD and potentially be a decent spot for someone to start a grow operation, probably access the commercial power, infrastructure, all that kind of stuff. I'm thinking, you got my gears turning when you started mentioning some.
I think the grow operations, I think you have really emphasized that, and I think that's good, because they are distinct from the retail operations, and you can be more flexible. And if that were appropriate through an SDG, because of whatever, that would be all right. I think that's not a bad way of going. Other thoughts, folks, about where you don't want it?
Can I just chime in, Chair?
Sure, go ahead.
I definitely like the idea of the inclusion of the B2, and maybe with frontage on New Haven Avenue, and maybe east of Commerce, to try to avoid some of that area downtown as you get closer to St. Michael's Church and things like that. And that's for the retail component. I also tend to agree with Dan that the innocuousness of a micro cultivator, I essentially look at it as a greenhouse, and those folks don't want to be seen. They don't want you to even know they're in there. Whether it's indoors or, to your point, Vince, 4 walls with no roof, they don't want you to know they're even there. So they're not going to be advertising. It's really just a place for people to work and grow and then ship things out of there. So I tend to agree with Dan that I think there does have to be a delineation between the retail component and the micro cultivator component in terms of where we want to allow it. But I definitely like the portions of the B2 and the MDD for the retail part. So thank you.
Thanks, Drew.
Yeah, Ryan, as far as the that map, I mean, how difficult would it be to start dropping in the churches and seeing what they eliminate? Because like to piggyback on what Dan was saying, churches downtown will probably eliminate downtown, de facto, but is there anything that the number of churches in town would that do, and that maybe make it a little bit easier because it pigeonholes us even more?
Raul, we can do it. We didn't do it because we had this other stuff off GIS a lot more easily for this discussion, but yes, we can pick off those uses.
We can pick them off, but I think the part of the logic, Raul and Vince will probably correct me on this, I'm sure, but is that we're trying to demonstrate how the liquor elements, if applied to retail for cannabis, would apply. You're not necessarily compelled to hold those same standards, but I think we were trying to use it as an example of similar restricted.
No, I think it's a great jumping off point.
Yeah, for the next discussion that we have here, we'll put that map together for you.
Perfect.
All right, so I think we're getting some pretty good directions. The intention is, Ted, I know you guys want to move fairly quickly. You want to be sort of, a leader in this new industry. Why don't we try to draft something up and circulate it to you in advance of your next meeting, so you guys can, you guys and ladies, sorry, will have an opportunity to review it and come up with some good comments, and then we can go from there. Process wise, this is going to be an amendment to the regulations, and based on what I'm hearing tonight, it's going to require a referral to the respective councils of government, because it will affect properties, or could affect properties within 500 feet of your municipal boundaries.
Sure.
That shouldn't hold you up, but we can put something together and circulate it in the next couple of weeks in advance of your meeting.
I think, Vince, you hit the nail on the head. It's more important that this commission has really kind of crafted where they would really like it. We just want to make sure we do it properly.
Yep.
And we cover all bases, because you brought things up tonight that I don't understand how they regulate it and what the different levels are. Certain things we don't have to worry about, certain things we do. I think the micro cultivator and the retailer, I think hitting on those two, and we're allowed one of each, goes back to let's get the best of what we have, of what is out there now, if we are the leaders in what we want to craft as regulations for it to allow it. And I think you got enough feedback from all commission members and knowing how you want to move forward now for next month. And anything we can get circulated in the meantime, we can for next month. We don't have to wait until next month.
Yeah, no, I would like to circulate sooner. And Ryan, I'll talk with Liz in the morning, and maybe we can we can circulate to Raul's question about the churches. We can drop that in so the commission can see that in advance and at least noodle it through in your own minds.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your efforts.
Thank Liz. She's
Thank you.
Liz was the brain.
She's not here.
I know. You can still,
the brain trust is not here. You get all the credit and you leave her home or to another meeting.
She's up. She's doing the POCD up in Southbury tonight.
Well, thank her for us. Please.
I will. Thanks, guys. Have a nice Thanksgiving.
Thank you. You too, Vince. Have a good one.